First, let me say thanks to Casey and to people that I've met while I've been here. You guys have a beautiful campus. The plant building hotel thing is amazing. It's awesome. Yeah, as Dr. Tillman said, today I'm going to be talking about pirates and sailors and stuff. And I thought I'd start just by saying that when I say the word pirate, if I tell you to think of a pirate, I probably have a pretty good chance of what you're going to think about. Right? It's either going to be this guy, right? Blackbeard. He's our standard pirate, fits every of the tropes, probably the most famous of the kind of golden age of pirates. Based on your age, probably this guy, right? You might think of Disney's Captain Jack Sparrow. Based on where we are, maybe anybody know who that is? Probably recognize it more if I did that, right? Jose Gaspar, right? Part of your Gasparilla thing, which is one of the reasons why I'm here today. One of the things that you may be thinking of too is this, right? Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean. Turn it off. Okay. All right, it took a minute. So one of the things that Pirates of the Caribbean, the ride, emphasizes, and one of the things that we've really kind of grown to like about the pirates is their carnivalesque way of life, right? And this actually comes from a philosopher, this guy named Mikhail Bakhtin, who has this theory of the carnivalesque, which is pretty much a subversion of standard norms through humor and chaos, right? And this goes back to these medieval carnivals where you would kind of upend the civil norms and people would have these revels where they could make fun of the bishops and all this sort of stuff, and you upended society. But then the next day, everything went back to normal and it was all safe, right? And we've made pirates safe. We've made it family fun. And if you actually look at what goes on in the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, it can be kind of disturbing, right? You have people looting and burning houses. You have people being tortured. You have general drunken carousing. And if you look at this one, you have sexual slavery going on. Right? If you've ever paid attention, you have these women over here who are terrified. They're tied up. They're scared about what's to happen. The sign above them says, auction, take a winch for a bride. Right? On the auction block here, you have this one woman who is kind of portly, and she looks really happy because the pirates are supposedly bidding on her, and she'll find a man finally. But then you also have this one that's dressed kind of like a strumpet, and she's got red hair, and she's pulling up her skirt, and the pirates are yelling, "We want the redhead," right? If you've ever been through the ride. And she looks happy, right? She's excited to be auctioned off to these people. So we've made piracy, we've made these things family entertainment. If you have kids, which probably many of you in here don't, but if you have younger brothers or sisters, you may know Jake from Jake and the Neverland Pirates. Right? Now what I want to point out about Jake is what he has on his hat. Right? In Jake and the Neverland Pirates, he's wearing the skull and crossbones, this ubiquitous pirate symbol, right? The Jolly Roger. Now, the Jolly Roger, the symbol, the skull and crossbones symbol, has been used to symbolize death for centuries. Right? You can go back and look in medieval crypts on tombstones, and you'll see a skull and crossbones. It represents death. It means it's a death's head. In the maritime world, captains, when a sailor would die, they would draw a little skull and crossbones in the logbook by that sailor's name to indicate the day that they died. There's a lot of reasons why they kind of did this. One of the reasons is sailors were really uncomfortable about the idea of death because at sea you have no tombstone, so you have no marker, so they kind of drew it in the book as maybe a way of giving the sailors that. But what pirates use these for, and this also represents some of the complex relationships that pirates have for sailors, pirates have with violence, is because if you think about what a pirate is doing, right? And when a pirate captures a ship and wants to get the goods, right, he's trying to get the stuff out of the ship. Now, if you fire off your cannons and do all this sort of stuff, what might happen to the ship you're trying to capture? It might sink. You might destroy the goods in it. Pirates aren't getting gold most of the time, right? They're not getting treasure. They're getting goods. They're getting fabrics and material and food that then they're going and selling and all this sort of stuff. But if they are really actually violent, they might destroy a lot of this stuff. So pirates used branding very, very well. We don't think about branding as being something that comes from the 17th or 18th century, but what pirates were doing when they would show the death's head was saying like, hey, I'm gonna kill you, so you should probably stop what you're doing, right? It was a way when you raise the pirate flag, the other ship would know who you are, and what it kind of symbolizes is like, hey, death is coming for you if you fight back. Now, if you don't, maybe we'll let you go. And what's neat about this is pirates take this iconography and they change it. So this flag actually comes from a guy named Edward England, who was a pirate during the late 17 teens, which is when most of the pirates you may know of were actually working all at the same time. This one, Calico Jack Rackham, kind of takes the same theme as the skull and crossbones, but changes it a bit with the swords, makes it a little more violent. What's interesting about Jack Rackham, he was also the captain that two female pirates sailed with, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, you may have heard of before. And by all accounts, they were more violent than he was. Right? He got his name Calico Jack because he always wore these really flowery calico printed shirts and stuff. Here you have Emmanuel Wynne. This is the first recorded Jolly Roger. And you see he also has a skull and crossbones, but he also incorporates this other symbol. It's an hourglass. Right? It means your time is running out or your time is short before death comes for you. There's a guy, Christopher Moody, who Jolly Roger, a lot of people think is kind of an Americanization of the Gilet Rouge, right, which is a red flag. So you could sometimes see red flags that pirates would use, and here Moody. And if you kind of taking what you know from the iconography, you got an hourglass with wings. Your time is flying away, right? Your time is running away before this violent sword is going to kill you, right? So it's almost kind of like a pictogram on his flag. This is one of my favorites. This is Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart. Now, if you notice what he has, it's actually a picture of himself. This is his second flag. This is his later one. He's standing on two skulls with some initials down here. The ABH means a Barbadian's head, and the AMH means a Martinican's head. Now, he adopted this flag in 1720 after the governments of Barbados and Martinique sent two heavily armed schooners out after him and killed some of his crew and damaged his ship. He got away, and he created this flag saying, like, you know what, if you're from Barbados or Martinique, I'm taking my revenge on you. Right? So any Martinican or any Barbadian I find, I'm going to kill you first. I'm going to make sure you're dead. Right? So pirates used these. Here, anybody know? Blackbeard. This was Blackbeard's flag. Right, here again, some different iconography. You've got a skeleton, which is a representative of death. One of the great things about Blackbeards is you notice it has horns. So this is a demon skeleton. We'll talk about this in a second. Holding an hourglass, your time is running out. Holding a spear, stabbing a bleeding heart. Right? You're going to have a violent death very soon. Right? This is Blackbeard. But yet, remember, pirates don't really want to be violent. They just want you to think they're going to be. Now, Blackbeard in particular is kind of the master of branding. Right? He gets his nickname from the visage that he kind of wore. Right? This is not true either, by the way. But his nickname comes from this extravagant beard that he wore curled and braided and put ribbons throughout. And in a description of him that comes from the 1720s, it says that during battle, he, quote, wore a fur cap and stuck a lighted match on each side under it. And appearing on each side of his face, his eyes naturally looking fierce and wild, made him altogether such a figure that imagination cannot form an idea of a fury from hell to look more frightful. So Blackbeard wanted you to think he was a demon. And he really reveled in creating this idea, even among his crew. One of my favorite stories about Blackbeard, this comes from a 1724 book called The General History of Pirates, written by Captain Samuel Johnson, who many people think is actually Daniel Defoe. But he said of Blackbeard one time, he was real drunk, hanging out with his crew, and he said to them, quote, "Come, let us make a hell of our own and try how long we can bear it." Right? So they all go below decks and they seal up all the hatches and they light these fires and they throw sulfur from gunpowder in it. And sulfur is also kind of called brimstone, right? Fire and brimstone. So they make the atmosphere under decks hellish, can't breathe. And Johnson says, quote, that Blackbeard was, quote, not a little pleased that he held out the longest. Right? So Blackbeard was really kind of advocating this idea, and books like Johnson's were working to show that pirates were these kind of demons that needed to be eradicated, or they were meaningless vermin that were just disrupting the economic system of the Atlantic. But at the same time, books like Johnson's General History of Pirates was praising pirates. Right? Johnson's book says about pirates, he compares them to the founders of Rome. He says, Rome, the mistress of the world, was no more at first a refuge for thieves and outlaws, and if the progress of our pirates had been equal to their beginning, had they all united and settled in some of those islands, they might, by this time, have been honored with the name of a commonwealth, and no power in those parts of the world could have been able to dispute it with them. Right? This guy named Amadeo Policante wrote a book called The Pirate Myth, where he says that pirates became a symbol of elemental freedom, which negated all the values celebrated by European civilization, right? Values of reason, discipline, order. Pirates just subverted all of that stuff, right? And with comments like this, that they kind of laud the imperial power that kept pirates in check, but they also harbored a complicity with pirates as symbols of freedom and independence in the face of these kind of imperial powers. And about Blackbeard himself, he tells us that Blackbeard is an example of, quote, to what pitch of wickedness human nature may arrive if its passions are not checked. And he goes on to say that he was a courageous brute who might have passed the world for a hero had he been employed in a good cause. Right? So pirates were these people with potential, but they were overly passionate. They weren't in control. And in the 1700s, this is the rise of the Enlightenment era. This is when reason and order are valued, and pirates kind of ran against that. Now, that's not to say that people didn't love pirates in their day. Now, if you're a pirate and you're getting these goods and things, they're not going to do you any good at all if you're at sea, right? So what pirates had to do is they had to go to shore. Now, you'd think if they're so bad, as soon as they get to shore, people wouldn't want to deal with them, they'd be captured, but they don't, right? Blackbeard himself had a house in Bath, North Carolina, right up the Pamlico River. The governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, had a plantation right across the bay from Blackbeard's house. When Blackbeard and his pirates would come to town, everybody would get excited because the pirates brought in goods from across the world, right? And the pirates came in and they wanted to spend their money. The whole idea of the drunken sailor ashore is very true in a lot of ways. So pirates would come and they would go to the taverns and they'd spend their money. They'd bring in these goods that people could then buy and become cosmopolitan. In this little teeny town in Bath, they could have the same kind of goods that they were getting in Philadelphia or Boston or New York or London. And so they felt special and big. Blackbeard would throw parties and everybody would want to go to them. And so they were happy when the pirates were around. Interestingly enough, so Ocracoke here, this is where Blackbeard finally dies. They found his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, in the mid-90s. One of my friends from middle school and high school, this guy named Joseph Wild-Ramsing, his dad, Mark Wild-Ramsing, was the lead underwater archaeologist on the Queen Anne's Revenge. So my 6 degrees of separation from Blackbeard is only 2 degrees, which I think is pretty cool, right? So pirates in port are very similar, this drinking and carousing, all sorts of stuff, very similar to sailors in port. Should stop now. It's supposed to stop. All right. So the line between sailor and pirate was pretty thin, right? The idea that pirates was this unique band was actually quite wrong. Whenever pirates would capture a ship, Charles Johnson in General History of Pirates talks about how surprising it is how easily sailors would just stop what they were doing and join the pirate crews, right? Because they offered these opportunities that actual sailors didn't have working under these kind of oppressive captains and in these horrible conditions. But sailors, when they came to shore, any sailor, often caused a lot of problems. Right? They came and they drank too much and they got in fights and they kind of destroyed the city. All the things that Tampa's probably going to have to deal with day after tomorrow. Sailors did that every time they came to port. And so sailors are kind of paradoxical. People want them to come. The businesses love it. All of the businesses along the river probably love Gasparilla because people are going to spend a ton of money. Right? They can charge more. Same thing happens here. Right? But sailors come in, they fill up the jails, and it's very kind of paradoxical. Now this goes back to the beginning of America. Even in Jamestown, in like 1607, John Smith talks about how when the sailors would show up for resupply ships, all the colonists would be really excited because the sailors, he says, made good cheer. Right? They made everybody happy because they would have extra beer, and beer was safer than water back then. And in Jamestown, they didn't have much fresh water, so sailors would come, and you could get some beer, you could get some aqua vitae, sailors would trade with you. And John Smith says that, he says, quote, "Now the arrival of this first supply so overjoyed us, we could not devise too much to please the mariners." Right? They did everything they could, but when the mariners come, and they trade, they screw everything up. Right? Sailors don't have any connection to the land where they are at that time. Right? They're transient. So if they have a bunch of stuff and they want something else, they're not saving for the future. They'll trade whatever they want. Right? But in Jamestown, there was a very kind of carefully negotiated trade economy. And the sailors came in and they screwed it up. Right? John Smith said that after the sailors leave, stuff that they used to be able to get for an ounce of copper with the native groups, they couldn't even get for a pound of copper. So the sailors really kind of messed things up. This continues in the early 1700s, in like 1712, Cotton Mather writes about the fishermen in Boston and Salem and about how drunk they were and how lewd they were and how they would get into fights. And he writes these sermons. He's got these kind of famous pirate sermons that he gives at the execution of some pirates. But he also talks about sailors in the same way. Right? So sailors are problematic. Now, not only are they problematic, but the places that they lived become problematic. Now, the major American cities in the 1700s and the 1800s are Boston, Philadelphia is the largest city until right before the Revolution, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston in the south. All of these are port cities, right? So they're all having these sailors coming in. So sailors, they bring in the goods, they bring in money, but they're also coming from the tropics, coming from Africa. They bring in disease. Right? In the 1790s, there were some horrific outbreaks of tropical diseases, most notably yellow fever. Right, this is Philadelphia, this is New York. You can see the yellow fever epidemics are confined largely to dockside areas. If you notice here at this section of North Philadelphia where it gets really red, that became known as Helltown. And so you remember Blackbeard said, hey, let's make a hell of our own. Here in Philadelphia, they actually started to call the place where the sailors hung out the most Helltown. Right? But, this is a big but, in this same era, in the 1770s, sailors are integral to the burgeoning American conflict. Right? There's this group called the Sons of Liberty, right? Started by Sam Adams, really prominent in Boston. You might have heard of them before. Well, there was this ancillary group called the Sons of Neptune, right? Which was all just a bunch of sailors that kind of went along and did a lot of the same things. And a lot of the revolts in the years leading up to the Revolution were waterfront revolts, the most famous being the Boston Tea Party, right? So a lot of this stuff is happening on the coast. Right after the turn of the century, when we get into the 19th century, the War of 1812, it's fought primarily for free trade and sailors' rights. Let's see if this is going to work. I don't know why it's not turning off. The second click. Oh well. The rallying cry for the War of 1812 was free trade and sailors' rights, right? A lot of what the War of 1812 was fought over were maritime concerns. In the War of 1812, you also have this famous battle between this ship, the USS Constitution, and the HMS Guerriere, Right? The Constitution becomes known as Old Ironsides because there's this famous battle with the Guerriere, and the British ship was shooting cannonballs, and they were bouncing off the American ship. And a lot of this has to do with the physics of the wood that grew in America at the time, which is really actually fascinating, but I don't have time to talk about right now. But Britain was the most powerful navy in the world, and here America, this kind of upstart young country, defeats it in a one-on-one battle of these man-of-war ships. So even though the War of 1812 was pretty much a stalemate, the British burned the capital, and things went pretty much back to the way they were after the war. Nothing really was gained. Sailors became a really big rallying cry. In 1813, while the war was still kind of fresh, this popular magazine in New England called the Portfolio called for authors to take up the idea of sailors and use the promise of sailors for American audiences. It says, our naval victories, the proofs of what this nation is capable, cannot be too often cited and admired. They refresh our intellectual sense, they make us proud of ourselves and our country, and poetry can have no higher office among us than to embalm in its purest essence these brilliant deeds of heroism, to reflect in all their luster the images of great and glorious triumphs, to familiarize the national mind to acts of high and generous heroism, and thus, by preserving these lofty tone of its patriotism, make the remembrance of the old become the cause of future victories. So it was calling for Americans to use the sailor as this image of American patriotism. So it's kind of gone from this dangerous character to this image of American might. The person who does this the best and the most, surprisingly, James Fenimore Cooper. Right? When you think of Cooper, you probably think of, if anything, Last of the Mohicans. Right? Think of the mountains, of the frontier, of Indians, and all these other things. Well, Cooper writes 11 novels that are purely sea novels. That's a third of what he wrote. So he wrote a lot of sea novels. The first one, called The Pilot, was published in 1824, and it gives us this character of Long Tom Coffin. Right? Coffin is one of the most kind of idealized examples of a sailor you can find. He is a guy who was born on the water. He's not an officer, but everybody on the deck listens to him. He's this epitome of meritocratic promise. There's this great scene in the middle of the book where his ship, the Ariel, the one that he's on, is engaged with a British ship. The novel takes place during the American Revolution off the coast of England. It's a secret mission to kidnap some British aristocrats to ransom them. And his ship gets spotted and it gets into this gunfight with a British ship. Coffin, he always carries with him a harpoon. Right? He's from Nantucket, which is where the whaling industry was centralized, but he always carries a harpoon with him. He jumps up on the gunwale of his ship, or the gunwale, if you're going to be maritime about it. And he's about to leap off his ship onto the other, and there's a hail of bullets from the British ship, and he falls into the water, and everybody thinks he's dead, and they kind of cry out, "Oh, for Long Tom!" And they kind of re-engage the fighting, and all of a sudden, from the other side of the ship, Coffin crawls up out of the water. It says, looking like Neptune with his trident. And he gets up on the deck behind the British forces, and he throws his harpoon and stabs the British officer through the chest and pins him to the mast. Right? And it actually describes him like wiggling on it. And then the Americans win. Right? He's this kind of comes in and does this really amazing thing. When I first read this book, I was like, I need to make this into a movie. But I don't know anything about screenwriting. But the weird thing about Coffin is that he dies like halfway through the novel. He refuses to leave his ship. His ship runs aground, and he refuses to get out of the boat. Right? So he goes down with his ship. The actual main character of this is this guy named Mr. Gray, right? The pilot himself. And Mr. Gray is never named throughout, but you find out at the end that Mr. Gray is actually John Paul Jones. Right? John Paul Jones is the first American kind of maritime hero. He's the father of the Navy. He is famous for being on this ship, the Bonhomme Richard, and he gets into this fight with the Serapis, a British ship, and he actually he has this famous line where all of his masts get shot away, and the British captain yells at him, "Do you surrender?" And he yells back, "I have not yet begun to fight." right? And they actually win by some crazy stroke of luck. But the thing about Jones is that he was Scottish. He wasn't really American. And so the British considered him to be a pirate. Right? And in the book, the British characters talk about this pirate that is going on. Turns out they're talking about Jones. And he's a historical American figure, but Cooper kind of paints him in this ambiguous light. Right? He says at one point that he's only fighting for the Americans because they align with his political principles. It's not out of any kind of patriotic zeal. He's not a patriot. He's just doing this kind of moral thing that he thinks he ought to do, regardless of any kind of political affiliation. Right? So that's a step on the road to what pirates were doing. Right? He's this kind of a-national guy. Cooper's next novel, called The Red Rover, is more explicitly about a pirate. It's about this guy. His name is Heidegger, but he is a pirate who has this vicious reputation, but he's an ideological pirate. There's at one point in the novel where this guy Wilder, who's on Heidegger's ship, the Red Rover ship, he's having this discussion with him about being a pirate, and he's pulling out all these flags, right? And the rover is showing Wilder all these flags he sails under. And one actually legitimate method of maritime warfare was ships would fly the flags of other countries so they could get close enough to the ship they wanted to attack. And then it was okay to do that as long as before you started shooting, you dropped the flag and raised the right one, right? So an American ship could fly a British flag, get within shooting distance of a British ship, and as long as I dropped that and raised the American flag, everything was cool, right? So the rover shows how he's got all these flags he flies under, and then he pulls out a red banner, right? This is how the character knows he's actually the Red Rover. He's just got this blood red. He calls it a blood red field that he shows. But he says, when he's doing all this, but there's one flag that if it existed, I wouldn't even be here. I wouldn't be a pirate if there was an American flag. And this takes place right before the Revolution. And he says he only turned pirate because while he was a British officer, he was actually born in the colonies. The British officer on the ship he served on disparaged America, and so the guy struck him and he died. Right? So he killed an officer. Rather than kind of giving up and going to trial, which would have been a capital offense, he turned into a pirate and becomes this kind of scourge. Now, at the end of this novel, the novel takes place in the 1760s. The very last chapter is after the Revolution, and the very last paragraphs, this old guy gets pushed into the house of Wilder, one of the main characters, and nobody really knows who he is, but he's in this kind of covered buggy, and he comes up, and the guy looks in, and it's Heidegger, and he's injured, he's wounded. He sits up, and he holds up an American flag and lets it unroll down him, and he says, "Victory at last," and then he dies, right? So here again, Cooper's using a pirate to demonstrate this kind of ideological promise, right? Pirates, they lose all of their negative connotation that they maybe once had, and by the 19th century become these perfect images of political idealism, right? They are the rebels before there was really anything to rebel at in terms of American patriotism for the most part. In this same era, it's kind of interesting, terror at sea changes from being pirates, and it kind of takes on a more racial tone, right? What was truly terrifying in the 19th century wasn't pirates. It was the threat of slave revolt, right? So you have a guy like this. This is supposed to be Babu from Melville's novella Benito Cereno. It's kind of always anthologized. Maybe you've read it. This guy here, this really stylized drawing, this is the cook from Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Right? So you have a slave revolt, the slave kind of takes over the ship, or you have the racially charged mutineer. And in the story, he really does take an axe and kill all of the officers with an axe. It's pretty gruesome. Pym is an interesting story. You should read it. But so true terror at sea becomes racially motivated. Or there's one other part, the tyrannical captain, right? Someone who abuses the kind of capitalistic maritime system for their own ends. Here, Ahab. Now hang with me for a minute, because I'm going to make this little point that on some level, Ahab becomes a pirate, right? Becomes one of the most terrifying pirates, because what Ahab does is on some level more scary than Blackbeard being demonic. So Ahab, when he goes after Moby Dick, right? He's out there to hunt whales and fill up his ship with oil and go back home and take part in the kind of the economic system, right? Good capitalist. When he's out there, though, he decides, you know what? And he tells his crew, you guys aren't here to hunt for whales to fill up this ship with oil. He says, you're here to chase that white whale on both sides of land and over all sides of the earth till he spouts black blood and rolls fin out. And the way that he gets his crew to go along with him is that it's kind of blurry, but he offers them the promise of a $16 gold Spanish coin, right? A doubloon. The quintessential coin of pirate treasure, right? So Ahab offers his crew pirate treasure, says, anybody who sees the whale, this is yours. And everybody's like, yeah, let's do it. Except for one guy, Starbuck. Starbuck on Ahab's ship, the Pequod, is like the good capitalist. He's described as someone who, he's just there to make his money and go home. He doesn't have any kind of personal feeling about whales. He just wants to do his job. Right? And he tells Ahab this, and he's kind of Ahab's foil on this. Now, Ahab, he does also, though, kind of mimic somebody like Blackbeard in their occultish ways, right? Ahab has this kind of dark streak to him in more ways than one. I won't go on my classroom lecture on Moby Dick, but if you ever read the description of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, which Satan is the best character in Paradise Lost, right? Satan is one of the best literary characters ever. But Ahab's description and Satan's description from Paradise Lost are great. Or they're really similar. And to further the point, Satan in Paradise Lost isn't always bad, right? There's a moment where he sees Eve for the first time, and he's like, you know what? I don't want to be bad anymore. Like, this is so beautiful. But then he has to say, no, I'm going to be bad. I have to do it. Right? So what's kind of scary about Satan is that he's rational in his evil, right? Satan, he's not a demon, right? Satan's not scary looking. He's the most beautiful angel there is. He was the first angel, all sorts of. So Ahab, he kind of plays on this occultish stuff. He has at one point his own crew that pops out. These kind of Middle Eastern fire worshippers. The guy that's name is the Piracy, Fadala, and his crew, they pop up, and everybody thinks that they're kind of demons. Ahab, towards the end of the book, he has the blacksmith on the ship make him a special harpoon, right? That he's going to use. This is my Moby Dick killing harpoon. And he tempers it. You know, when you forge things, you have to quench it in water. Well, Ahab quenches this harpoon in the blood of the savage, quote-unquote, savage harpooners. Right, the harpooners on the Pequod are African, Native American, and Pacific Islander, 3 savage groups that America has kind of subdued. Ahab uses their blood to quench it, and when he does it, he says, Ego non baptizo te in nomine Patri, sed in nomine Diaboli, which, if you don't know my bad Latin pronunciation or can't read, means, I do not baptize you in the name of the Father, but in the name of the devil. Right? So he subverts, he's got this satanic baptism that he uses to make his Moby Dick killing spear. And so he does kind of have this demonic part to it. But what makes Ahab the most terrifying, though, isn't his occultish tendencies, but it's his rationality. It's the fact that he's not crazy. Right? Everybody has this idea of Ahab as this crazy captain who's going on this crazy thing, but he's not, and that's what makes him the most scary. There are multiple times in Moby Dick when Ahab thinks about what he's doing and knows that it doesn't feel right, but he can't stop. He doesn't want to stop, and he makes himself forge ahead. There's one time, there's the cabin boy Pip, who kind of goes, everybody thinks he goes crazy. One of the most beautiful lines in Moby Dick, Pip almost drowns, and he comes back up, and Ishmael tells us that he sees God's foot on the treadle of the loom and speaks it. Right? So he becomes the Shakespearean fool. If you've ever read King Lear, the fool in Shakespeare is the person who can speak truth to power. He's actually the closest person to the king. Pip plays that role, and Ahab says about Pip one time, because Pip tells him, hey, oh, my captain, let's not do this, let's go home. And Pip says, there is that in thee, poor lad, which I feel too curing to my malady. Like cures like, and for this hunt, my malady becomes my most desired health. So Ahab recognizes what he's doing is kind of crazy, but he wants to do it anyway. He embraces that. Starbuck, towards the end, is really trying to talk Ahab out of this. And one of the things you need to know about Ahab, too, is he's actually married, and he has a kid. Ahab is looking at Starbuck, his foil, towards the end of the novel, and he says to him, I see my wife and child in thine eye. No, no, stay on board, lower not when I do. When branded Ahab gives chase to Moby Dick, that hazard shall not be thine. No, no, with that faraway home I see in your eye. Right? So he tells him, like, look, you're making me not want to do this. You have to go away. And Ahab kind of goes on to say he's got this, his ideas about fate and stuff evolve over the novel. But he says right after that passage, he's thinking about why he's doing this. And Ahab says, what is it, that nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening, hidden lord and master, and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what, in my own proper natural heart, I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? Now Ahab's kind of musing, like, why am I doing this? And when he says this is the thing that terrifies Starbuck. And Ahab looks up, and Starbuck's gone, and it says Starbuck was blanched to a corpse's hue with despair, hearing this. Right? So Starbuck has been with Ahab through all of this, and the thing that terrifies him the most is Ahab saying, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm going to do it. Right? That rationality is what is so disturbing. Right? Even though he has these demonic and barbaric qualities that pirates had, in Ahab, that's underscored by erudition and rationality. That though he twists them for kind of wicked ends. Ahab presents to us this perfect prospect of rationality abused, something that we didn't give to the pirates, the prospect of rationality. In Ahab, he has reason, but it's made grotesque. And if reason is the tool of order, when reason is used in the benefit of disorder, then that's kind of the most disturbing thing you can think of. All right, so this is the key. If reason had checked Edward Teach, Blackbeard, if reason had checked Blackbeard's passions, according to Johnson, he wouldn't have become Blackbeard. He would have been a hero. Right? The other side of that, though, is that no rational person would be capable of doing what Blackbeard did. But Ahab does. Right? Ahab does just that. But we don't think of Ahab as a pirate. Because at this point, pirates have become caricatures of what they once were. Right? Even today, we've neutered the political descent of pirates. We've kind of forgotten all of that. And we've only embraced the carnival. Pirates now are just this mascot who are encouraging us to act, if just for a little while, as if our passions are not checked.
Do what you want, 'cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
All right. Thank you. Yeah.
My question is more along the lines of personal opinion. Would you have wanted to have been a pirate in that time period?
No. Because they only lived for about 2 years on average. Most of the pirates of the flags that I was showing you were active from 1717 to 1720, 1716 to 1719. I think the longest one was 1716 to 1722. So once somebody went pirate, they weren't a pirate for long. It's easy to romanticize being on the sea. There's this great line in Moby Dick, to go back to that for a second, where Ishmael, when he ships out, he talks about how he wants to see the world, right, and be a pirate, and be a sailor. And the guy who's signing him up says, okay, stand right here and look out on the water. Does that make you happy? Because that's all you're going to see, right? So it's easy to romanticize that life, but no, probably would not have been very good.
So what is like your favorite or most common pirate stereotype that you hear that's historically not true?
It's historically not true. Probably Talk Like a Pirate Day. I hate Talk Like a Pirate Day. It drives me crazy. But I think probably the buried treasure aspect, right? They didn't bury their treasure. They didn't really have treasure. If they got it, they spent it. Sailors didn't save their money. Any of them did. So the idea of a guy burying his treasure and making a map that one day you're going to find and go to an X on a desert island somewhere, that never happened. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting question, right? Because when we think about pirates today, we kind of have this really negative image of them. And I think a lot of that has to do with these pirates were Englishmen. They were white guys. Those pirates are Africans. And so there's a lot of stuff going on there, right? But the reality is that their lives and these pirates' lives were very, very similar. Right? These guys lived in horrifically disgusting, dirty conditions. They did not wear like nice, clean, frilly, sleeved things and well done feathers and all that sort of stuff. They lived very hard, dirty, mean lives. And they were doing what they were doing for many of the same reasons that the pirates are doing it now. Right? They are trying to make a living working against a government that is not allowing them to kind of make a living any other way. Many of the pirates turned to piracy just because they were privateers before, and a privateer is a legal pirate. And the government then would say, hey, you know what? That's not legal anymore. And they would say, well, this is what I do. I'm going to keep doing it. Right? So, yeah, very similar. Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. So the pirates in the age of piracy, most of them when we think of, they were Atlantic ones, but they would often go to the Indian Ocean even, or the coast of Africa, or pirates from the Barbary States, right? So the general history of the pirates that Johnson does focuses mainly on the European pirates, but Barbary piracy comes into more of its own in the literature in the early Republic, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when in talking about how they would capture American sailors, and there was an epidemic of American sailors being captured by Barbary Coast pirates. It's our first kind of war on Islam in America. The Barbary, there's an actual undeclared war that Jefferson kind of begins. The Algerian captives, slaves in Algiers, they deal a lot with the effects of kind of white Christian Americans being taken by these Muslim pirates and kind of what happens to them while they're there. Right? So a lot of the literature plays with that more religious kind of idea, right? Which is not uncommon to today too. Yeah.
Did the pirates ever make alliances among themselves? And if so, like how did they signify to other pirates that they were like on the same part of the same group?
Yeah, well, the flags, right? So generally pirates wouldn't kind of mess with other pirates, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a way, right? They're all against the governments. Many pirates started out as kind of crews of other pirates. So Blackbeard was originally in Stede Bonnet's crew and then kind of leaves him. Moody was originally with Bartholomew Roberts for a while, and so they would kind of split off and start their own. So they didn't really form alliances to do things together, right? So they didn't really like team up to attack something major. Really, one of the biggest things that happens is Blackbeard blockades the city of Charleston himself, for the most part. And interestingly enough, doesn't ask for any gold. He blockades the city of Charleston and asks for a medicine chest because people in his ship were sick, most likely with syphilis, and they needed some medicine. So he blockades the entire city himself and says, you know what, I'm going to stay here until you guys give me some medicine. And some people come out and try to kind of come at him, and he captures them. He strips them naked. He sends them back to Charleston, butt naked, and says, I'm not leaving. And so eventually the mayor of Charleston gives him what he wants, and he goes on his way. But he did that all on his own, right? So, yeah.
So I kind of want to reflect on the last slide.
Yeah.
While we're stuck with the carnival.
Okay.
And so I'm wondering if there's any kind of, if you see any contemporary political purchase in piracy, right? So some kind of pirate practice that will challenge dominant economic or political regimes. And by way of example, maybe going back to the first slide with Jack Sparrow.
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated with one of the pirates of the Caribbean, which puts the East India Trading Company, kills the Kraken,
Right.
and is out for dominance versus Jack Sparrow,
Yeah.
who in the end comes up to challenge this
Sure.
leviathan of economic practice.
Well, I mean, I think one of the easiest ways you see that is with like online music piracy, to be most specific, right? And the early days of like Napster and online music piracy really did shift the model of the music industry, right, in a lot of ways. So, you know, I think you get the word pirate from there, but I don't feel like most people make a big connection between like what was going on in the Pirates of the Caribbean to online music piracy or movie piracy or stuff like that. But it is kind of working in the same way. But you know, I don't think we think of like Napster as a pirate ship. And I think that on some level is why like for me at the very least, when we're thinking about pirates, we're just left with the carnival because we don't really think of, even though it's piracy, I would imagine a lot of people maybe in this room never really made the connection that like piracy, pirate, like it's its own thing almost, right?
So there's no practice per se, it's character.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. But it does it fills that void in the same way, right? We refuse to do this the way that you want us to, right? I'm not going to pay for this. I'm going to take it myself. There's nothing you can do to stop me. And rather than actually like going down and shutting everybody down, because I mean, in the I guess early 2000s, there were a couple of high-profile cases where the RIAA would go after like one or two individuals and make an example out of them, right? And you could draw these parallels to when they would hang pirates, they would hang them from the dock so everyone could see, right, to make an example out of them. But with that, like it didn't end it, and so eventually they had to kind of adapt. Piracy kind of works the same way, but it dies out for, I mean, a little bit of a different reason, right? The places become far more economically viable on their own, and piracy gets kind of pushed out to the margins even more. But yeah, I mean, that would be probably the best example. It'll be interesting to see, not to get political on it, but with things like the alternate. At lunch we were talking about alternative Twitter feeds that like the National Park Service and NASA is doing. These kind of subtle, kind of subverting the rules, but still playing within the field, but doing it differently. You know, you wouldn't be stretched too far to make connections ideologically, right? Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
What about the legends of like Davy Jones? Like, where does that all come from? Is there anything in early pirate literature that talks about it at all?
That's more sailor culture in general, right? And I did research on Davy Jones one time, and I had an answer, but I can't remember it off the top of my head right now. But I'll use that to say that like maritime culture as a whole, which again, pirates and sailors were on a continuum, right? People would go from a sailor to being a pirate to going back to a sailor in the same week, right? So it's not like pirates are one group and sailors are another. They all had kind of a shared culture. And maritime culture did craft all of these superstitions and traditions and music and song and all these sort of things that really do define culture for themselves, right? So a lot of the whole Davy Jones idea mostly stems, this is kind of where it comes from. I don't remember the word that got bastardized to become Davy Jones, but it had to do with the fact that at sea, you were buried at sea and you were generally tied up into a shroud. A cannonball or something heavy was tied into it too, and you were dropped overboard. And you went down to the bottom, right, which is where Davy Jones' locker is. And so that's kind of where it kind of comes from as a meaning of like you're going to die or something bad's happened to you. Yeah, thanks. Saw another? Yeah.
So previously you mentioned how the pirates never sought to destroy the ships that they were seeking the goods from. What would they do once they got the goods? Did they
Yeah.
just like let them on their merry way?
Yeah, most of the time they would. They would ask the crew. So generally what they would do is if a ship left its sails, stopped, and the pirate ship kind of came up and they boarded, they would get all of the crew kind of in one area. They would take what they wanted and they would ask, like, hey, who wants to join us? And people did. Then they would leave and the ship would sail on. Right? So that's ideal, right? That's best case scenario. Captains would have a wide range of reasons for not wanting to give up their cargo, right? They would get in trouble for it. So if a captain did fight back or try to run, make it more difficult, occasionally a pirate would make an example of someone, but not kill everyone. So then other people could go and say, like, hey, Blackbeard did this, and this is the kind of thing Blackbeard does, and then their legend grows, right? Yeah.
Time for probably one more.
Great.
Pirates ever plunder other pirate ships, or do they
Yeah, not much. Generally, if they were going to kind of plunder another pirate, there's not that I can remember any accounts of like a pirate battle, right? But like when Blackbeard leaves Stede Bonnet, he kind of robs him of everything he has to go start his own, right? They kind of put him on a ship and we're like, later, dude, and kind of take all of his stuff. But that's almost more of like a mutiny than a pirate v. pirate conflict. Yeah, no, and again, like pirates didn't want to fight, right? I mean, they didn't. You don't want to go out and like put yourself in a situation where you might die very easily. If you get into a cannon fight with another ship, right? You die very horribly, right? You don't die because like a cannonball hits you. You die because a cannonball hits the wood and makes these gigantic splinters, and you get impaled by wood or shrapnel, right? So it's not like you take a cannonball to the chest and you're obliterated. It's more like you take a 3-foot sliver of wood to the side and you bleed out, or you get septic and you die in a couple of days, a really horrible death, right? So you don't want to take that risk if you can avoid it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Walden.
Thank you,
Just
Brett.
1 second before you go, and we thank you for coming. So this symposium was also brought to you by the English and Writing Scholar Symposium series, and there are several more. So if you're interested in this, we bring in speakers who have studied literature, who've studied journalism, who've studied rhetoric. If you're really interested in this is what we do in English and Writing. We study culture and art and literature and politics and combinations of all of those fascinating things, and we get paid to do it, so that's really cool. You can actually have a career studying pirates. So we should all be so lucky. Our next honor symposium is February 6th at 10 a.m. It's in Reeves, and it's with Dr. Steve Kuchera. He's going to be talking about science literacy in our society, and sustainability, which is a hot topic right now, so I definitely encourage you to come for that. I hope to see you all there. Join me in thanking Dr. Walden.